Somewhere, deep underground, a team of researchers made a discovery that should have changed everything. It should have made headlines. It should have been studied, debated, and taught in classrooms. Instead, it disappeared. Not slowly, not through neglect. It vanished almost overnight. And the people who were closest to it, they stopped talking. Today, we're going to look at one of the most unsettling skeleton discoveries ever documented. What was found, what the evidence suggested, and why so many people believe the full story was never allowed to surface. Stay with me, because this one goes deeper than you think. The story begins the way so many strange discoveries do, quietly and in a place most people have never heard of. A team of researchers was conducting a routine excavation, remote location, difficult terrain, the kind of dig that rarely produces anything more than pottery shards and animal bones. But then, something changed. At first, it looked like a standard human skeleton. Arms, legs, a rib cage, a skull. The kind of thing that in other circumstances wouldn't have raised any alarms. But almost immediately, something felt wrong. Not in the way that makes you second-guess yourself and move on, but in the way that makes you stop completely, put down your tools, and look again. Because the more they looked, the less it made sense. The skull was the first thing they noticed. It was larger than expected, significantly so, not in a way that could be attributed to simple size variation. The cranial volume was outside the normal range for modern humans. Then the eye sockets, unusually shaped, wider, and set at an angle that didn't match the anatomy of Homo sapiens or any closely related species they could immediately reference. And then the bones themselves. The density was off. Modern human bones have a specific structure, a balance between compactness and porosity that develops over a lifetime. This skeleton didn't follow that pattern. Some areas were denser than expected, others far lighter. The distribution was inconsistent, almost like the skeleton had developed under conditions that were fundamentally different from anything in the known fossil record. One of the researchers, according to documents that were later circulated in limited academic circles, reportedly said, "This is either the most important discovery of the last 100 years, or someone made a very serious mistake." At the time, no one was sure which it was, but they were certain of one thing: this required immediate, rigorous analysis. And that's exactly when things started to get complicated. When scientists analyze ancient skeletal remains, there's a well-established process. You document everything. You photograph, you measure, you take samples, you compare the morphology, the shape and structure against known species. You date the remains using radiometric methods when possible, and then you publish, peer review, and refine your conclusions over time. It's not a fast process, but it's a thorough one. And initially, that process began. The skeleton was cataloged, measurements were recorded, early comparisons were made, and the results were immediately puzzling. When researchers compared the skull and bone structure against the known fossil record, they found something that had no clean explanation. The skeleton shared features with multiple species, but didn't fully match any of them. There were traits consistent with archaic humans, the kind of characteristics you'd associate with early Homo sapiens, or even pre-sapiens populations from hundreds of thousands of years ago. But there were also features that were more modern, more refined, in some ways more advanced than what you'd expect from an ancient specimen. It didn't fit neatly into the evolutionary timeline. And in science, when something doesn't fit, you have a few options. You can investigate further, you can question your methodology, you can consider whether your existing framework might be incomplete, or, and this is where things get uncomfortable, you can find ways to make it fit, even if that means bending the data. Now, most scientists would never do that consciously, but institutions have pressures, timelines have to be maintained, funding has to be justified, and discoveries that create more questions than answers are not always welcomed. The skeleton, according to the limited documentation available,
had features that some researchers believed pointed to a previously unknown branch of human evolution. Not a different species entirely, but not quite the same lineage either. Something in between. A branch that, according to everything we thought we knew, shouldn't exist. And that raised a question that nobody seemed eager to answer. If this branch existed, where did it come from? And more importantly, where did it go? Now, before we go further, I want to be clear about something. In situations like this, there's always a spectrum of explanations, and the most dramatic explanation isn't always the right one. So let's work through them, seriously and honestly. Theory 1. Scientific uncertainty. This is the most straightforward explanation, and it deserves to be taken seriously. Archaeology and paleoanthropology are not exact sciences. Remains degrade. Soil conditions alter bone structure. Dating methods have margins of error, and field conditions, especially in remote locations, are rarely ideal. It's entirely possible that what appeared to be anomalous features were the result of degradation, environmental factors, or misinterpretation of damaged remains. Unusual skull shape could be post-mortem deformation, compression from soil and sediment over time. Unusual bone density could be a localized pathology or the result of preservation conditions specific to that particular site. This explanation is clean, it's mundane, and it fits the data in ways that don't require any extraordinary assumptions. But, and this is important, it doesn't fully account for what happened afterward. Because if this was simply a misidentified specimen, the normal scientific response would be to document why, correct the record, and move on. That didn't happen. Theory 2. Misidentification and premature classification. A more nuanced version of Theory 1 is that the skeleton was real, the measurements were accurate, but the interpretation was flawed. This happens more than people realize. Early interpretations of fossil discoveries have been wrong before, sometimes significantly so. Bones from different individuals get mixed together, context gets lost. Enthusiastic researchers occasionally project meaning onto evidence that doesn't support it. If this is the case, the disappearance of follow-up research could simply reflect institutional embarrassment, scientists quietly stepping away from a claim that couldn't be substantiated. It's not sinister, it's human. But again, the silence was unusually complete, not just a retraction or a quiet acknowledgement of error, but a near total absence of follow-up in any direction. That's harder to explain.
Theory 3. An inconvenient discovery. And then there's the theory that, for many people, is the hardest to dismiss. What if the discovery was real and accurate, but created a problem that was easier to bury than to solve? Human evolutionary history is not as settled as textbooks sometimes imply. In recent decades, discoveries like Homo naledi in South Africa, the Denisovans in Siberia, and Homo floresiensis in Indonesia have repeatedly forced scientists to revise what they thought they knew. Every few years, a new fossil discovery adds a branch to the family tree that nobody knew existed. So the idea that there could be another unknown branch, another group of humanoid beings who lived alongside our ancestors, interbred, diverged, or simply disappeared, is not fringe speculation. It is increasingly the baseline expectation. What is unusual is when evidence of such a group surfaces and then goes quiet. Because the history of paleoanthropology and archaeology is not without examples of discoveries that were minimized, mishandled, or, in some documented cases, actively suppressed because they challenged the prevailing scientific consensus. Piltdown Man is the most famous example of fraud, but that was fabricated evidence inserted into the record. What about real evidence that was quietly removed? It's a different kind of problem, and a harder one to detect. So, let's talk about what happened after the initial discovery, because this is where the story becomes genuinely strange. Shortly after the skeleton was documented, something shifted. Access to the information became restricted.
Not through any formal announcement, no press release, no published retraction, no statement from the institution involved, just a gradual closing of doors. Researchers who had been involved went quiet. Papers that were apparently in preparation were never submitted. References to the skeleton in academic correspondence, what little can be traced, simply stop. And then the silence set in. For something of this potential significance, the absence of follow-up is almost as remarkable as the discovery itself. In science, when something is wrong, you say so. You publish the correction. You explain the methodology error. You provide the evidence that overturned the original interpretation. What you don't do, what you almost never do, is simply stop talking about it. Because silence raises more questions than a retraction ever could. Now, I want to be careful here. Absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence. The fact that follow-up research disappeared doesn't automatically mean something sinister occurred. Funding dries up, institutions dissolve, researchers move on to other projects, records get lost, genuinely lost, not hidden. All of those things happen. But they tend to leave traces, partial records, correspondence, grant applications, something. In this case, the trail goes cold in a way that's difficult to account for through ordinary institutional entropy. And that is what keeps people coming back to this story. Not the skeleton itself, but the silence around it. There's a principle in investigative research that's sometimes called the dog that didn't bark, borrowed from a Sherlock Holmes story. The idea is that sometimes the most important clue isn't what happened, it's what didn't happen. In this case, the papers that weren't published, the debates that weren't had, the corrections that were never issued. Those are the dogs that didn't bark, and they're loud. Here's what makes this case more than just an isolated curiosity. It isn't the only one. Across the history of paleoanthropology and archaeology, there is a pattern, not a conspiracy, but a pattern of discoveries that disrupted the established timeline, being handled with what can only be described as extraordinary caution. Some of those discoveries were genuinely flawed, and the caution was warranted, but not all of them.
The Denisovans, for example, an entire branch of ancient humanity, were known to specialists for years before the broader scientific community was willing to engage with the implications. The evidence was there, the genetic data was compelling, but the conversation moved slowly. Homo floresiensis, the so-called hobbit skeleton found in Indonesia, was met with decades of fierce resistance from parts of the scientific establishment, even as the physical evidence became increasingly difficult to dismiss. And those are the cases we know about, the ones where the discovery was too substantial to fully contain. What about the cases where the evidence was more ambiguous, where the specimen was less complete, where the documentation was less robust? Those cases are far more vulnerable to being set aside, quietly, without resolution, without explanation. And if even a fraction of them represent genuine discoveries that were mishandled or prematurely discarded, then our picture of human evolution is not just incomplete, it has deliberate gaps in it. Now, I am not saying that there is a coordinated effort to suppress the truth about human history. That's a strong claim that would require strong evidence. What I am saying is this: institutions have incentives, scientists have careers, and the history of science is full of examples of inconvenient truths taking decades longer than they should have to receive the recognition they deserved. That's not a conspiracy, that's just how knowledge systems work. Slowly, imperfectly, and with enormous resistance to anything that forces the map to be redrawn. The question is, what happens to the discoveries that never get that second chance? So, let's come back to where we started. A skeleton, unusual proportions, features that didn't fit the known record, and then silence. Was it a misidentification? Possibly. Probably, some would say. Was it a genuine discovery that was mishandled? Maybe. Or was it something that couldn't be neatly explained, and so it was set aside not because the evidence was weak, but because the implications were too large to manage? We don't have a definitive answer, and I think it's important to be honest about that.
What we do have is a pattern worth paying attention to, because the story of human evolution is not finished. It's being written right now, in laboratories, in excavation sites, in DNA analysis facilities around the world. And every few years, something surfaces that changes the chapter we thought we'd already closed. So the real question isn't whether this skeleton was real. The real question is, what else might be out there, sitting in an archive somewhere, logged in a database, filed under inconclusive, waiting for someone to look again? If you found this interesting, or if you think there's something to this story that deserves more attention, the comment section is open. I read everything. And if you want to go deeper on the patterns of suppressed or overlooked discoveries in human evolutionary science, the next video is already waiting for you. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and I'll see you in the next one.